Assalamu alaikum. You're watching Views News and I'm Faisal Rehman live from our Islamabad studios. Today we'll be talking about this very developing issue and a story that is about the Ukrainian issue. As we all know that now there's a standoff and the Americans, they have asked around 8,500 of their soldiers to be on a standby. At the same time, very strong and strict, I would say, statements being issued by the American President, Mr. Biden, as well as the UK's Prime Minister, Mr. Boris Johnson. And as we all know that both these countries have also sent military aid to the Ukrainian government, whereas when it comes to Germany, they have also deployed their forces in one of their islands. But having said that, they have said that they'll not be supporting any military aid, rather they will be supplying the medical side of it. Perhaps they'll be looking after the injured in case of a conflict. Now, since a lot has been developing and the Russians, they have around 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border, almost ready. And having said that, the Russian President, Mr. Vladimir Putin, says that now the West is exaggerating the story. Basically, when you exaggerate it to a level where the Western media is showing as if the countries are at a brink of war and perhaps the entire fault is of the Russian government. But it seems that the way forward should be, again, talks. But again, there is a red line. The moment the NATO forces will be deployed all along the Ukrainian border, perhaps inside Ukraine, things would escalate. This is what the fear is. As we all know that a lot of other Baltic states, whether you talk about Lithuania, Latvia, and related Baltic states that were in fact given independence way back in 1991 onwards. Now, a lot of NATO troops have also been deployed there. You talk about Sweden, they are also pretty much geared up and they have been talking to their Finnish friends out there to see what's going on in the Baltic region, especially when you talk about the live fire kind of an exercise conducted by the Russians. But situation is pretty fluid. But having said that, what exactly is going to happen? That is $1 million question. Is it going to get into a major conflict, or it is going to be resolved through talks? But it seems that something is brewing out there. But interestingly now, before I introduce you to our guests who will be talking on this very important topic, before that our production team has prepared a report. Let's watch that first and then we'll continue our debate.
Between Russia and the United States and allies are growing as the Russian military buildup at the Ukrainian border shows no sign of dissipating and crisis talks remain at an impasse. United States President Joe Biden on 19 January 2022 predicted that Russia will make a move on Ukraine and warned that it is going to be a disaster for Russia if they invade Ukraine. Due to these ongoing tensions, the Washington and Moscow's top diplomats met on 21 January 2022 in Geneva and agreed to keep working on easing tensions over Ukraine, and United States promised written response to Russian security requirements. Moreover, United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken, in this meeting with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, renewed warnings of the severe Western reprisals. On the other hand, the Russian Foreign Ministry after this meeting said that Sergei Lavrov had vowed the most serious consequences if Washington kept ignoring Moscow's security demands. Though Russian officials have repeatedly denied planning to invade, but the Kremlin has massed some 100,000 troops near Ukraine's borders. Recently, after a virtual meeting between United States President Joe Biden and European and NATO leaders, the White House stated that allies expressed their shared desire for a diplomatic resolution to tensions with Moscow, but they also warned Russia of massive consequences if it invades Ukraine.
Now, to talk about this, we have with us in our studio, on my right, is Professor Dr. Zafar Nawaz Jaspal Saab, expert on foreign affairs and international relations. Dr. Saab, pleasure to have you in the show, sir. Thank you so much for your time. And on Skype, we have with us from London, United Kingdom, Sami Hamdi, the Managing Director of the International Interest, Geopolitical Analyst. Thank you so much, Hamdi Saab, for your time. And we also have with us Lieutenant General retired Amjad Shoaib Saab. Jal Saab is a senior analyst. Sir, pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your time. General Shoaib. But let me start off from you, Professor Saab. Now, situation seems to be very fluid. We've also learned that 8,500 of the American troops are on high alert. A couple of countries, they've also sent their troops. I mean, things are getting slightly interesting, I would say, because the Swedish, they are talking to their counterparts in Finland. The Germans, they have also deployed a couple of their naval assets in one of their island in the east of the Baltic. And then you talk about statements issued today, a little while ago, by Boris Johnson, where he has really alarmed the whole world that this could be the beginning of a war. Mr. Biden has very categorically mentioned that we will not back out, and the Russians should not dare to invade Ukraine. But so the Western media, in particular, whether you talk about BBC or CNN or even Deutsche Welle or whichever channel I've seen, especially the European channels, they are in fact just trying to portray Vladimir Putin as a villain, and on top they are talking about the aggression of the Russians. Whereas, sir, when you talk about the kind of military aid that has been sent to the Ukrainian military, anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, by the Americans as well, by the British. Sir, NATO versus Russia, and it seems that one is holding the neck, the other one is keeping the gun on the head of the other person. This is the situation. Where can it lead? And if it escalates, what is that supposed to mean for Europe in particular, sir?
My understanding is that it's too much exaggerated situation. If I can take your point which you mentioned correctly, but still I am convinced the NATO and especially Germans, they are not interested to fight a war. Even within the United States, there is a very strong academic discourse on it, and they use the word liberal delusion, starting with the Ukrainian and then looking the other, you can say, color revolutions. We have to take into account that in the Ukraine, this crisis is not only by the separatists, but within the Ukraine, there is a problem of political instability. Eastern and Western Ukrainians have different perceptions, there is a corruption, and there is a way out. Generally, what I have heard from the various ways that if the Putin invade, the Americans prefer to go for political and economic sanctions. They threaten that they can go for cutting the second gas pipeline, but they have to realize that Europe is not ready to freeze. European strategic culture has been withered out with the passage of time. So after the Second World War and starting to date, if they think that these Europeans within the NATO, they are willing to fight for the Ukraine, I have my doubt. Yes, there are 3 countries. It means that 2 now, United Kingdom and America,
and
United
these 2
States,
countries really matter.
and these 2 countries matter, and they have why they are saying these kind of statements, that in the 1994, including Russia, these 3 countries has a memorandum of understanding with Ukraine that they ensure its sovereign existence, sovereign territorial existence, and that's why Ukraine at that time agreed to give up the nuclear weapons. But after...
Now that was a great development, Professor. I'm sorry to cut you here, sir. We'll just have to take a short break here. Yeah. After the break, we'll return and we'll continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now, Dr. Saab, please, you may continue.
I was just mentioning that in the 1994, there was a Budapest Agreement or Memorandum of Security Understanding, and the grantor of that was United Kingdom, United States, and Russia. And in return, the Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, which were on its territory. Now, from that onward, there was a responsibility. But we have to not forget that every time Americans ensure the Russians, or Russians said that there are certain, you can say, integral part of their defense, especially Ukraine. If you recall in 1941, when the Nazis invaded, they invaded through the Ukraine, and then the war was there in addition to Poland. Similarly, historically and presently, they are not ready to accept, though the many Eastern European or ex-Russian members of the former Soviet Union states, they joined the NATO and the strength is 30th. Now, we have to wait and see. The troops numbers which you have mentioned, 8,000, 20,000, 30,000, of course it's a European theater. Definitely it's not an operation. If the war will start, definitely it will be very devastating and economically not bearable by the Europeans. Now here we have to see that one mistake can lead to a bigger. My understanding is that though in the media there are different projections, but the American State Secretary and when his counterpart Russians met in Geneva, the wording was that the meeting was promising and they were confident that they were able to manage the you can say situation in a better way.
That particular meeting ended without any breakthrough.
Yeah, but on the other side, is Europe willing to go for a sanctions? Because in 2014 when Crimea was annexed, everyone was expecting that there were harsher sanctions against Russia, but nothing. Even immediately Hungary you can say negotiated $10 billion US contract of the energy, and similarly the others. Then we have seen the Germany started a pipeline construction. They are not ready or willing to do that. So in this power politics, or you can say, what is the choice? The choice of the Americans is that the separatists in this, you can say, the separatists and the pro Western forces engage the Russians in a war of attrition. But my understanding is that, which was rightly projected by the intelligence services head of the Ukrainian as well, that if the war started, the Russians will be going to use the bombers and the missiles, which will destroy the, you can say, ammunition centers and the deployments, and what else. So we need a force, and that will be logistical, and then the more troops.
Can that war, just in case if there is a war, can that war go beyond the borders of Ukraine, sir?
I think Russians try to take, because if the war will remain limited at the Ukraine border, then the NATO or the Ukrainians' interest will be served, because in a small limited border war, Russians will be not able to prevail, because Ukrainians in the last 7 years, nationalism, force, and that, as you mentioned, that the supply chain of the anti-tanks, blah, blah. But the Russians, why they can go and fight on their dictates? Russians will go for the air raids, Russians will go for the missiles.
So there were multiple options.
Multiple options. And if the NATO countries attack participators, Russians have other options as well. And you have to also take into account the Russians in the name of that they are going to have a exercise in Belarus with the, and that is a state in between the Ukraine and the Russian troops are there. And Putin is not ready to compromise, because if he compromises, then his famous slogan, Russian grandeur, and his 30 million Russian ethnicity protection project, and these kind of the things. So my understanding is that the rationality will prevail and war will be averted. But this, what we call it, the states where, as I used the word earlier, this liberal delusion, which has been costing many things. Americans try to use these Western democratic or these kind of things, but then they feel. But we have to not forget
because
the Russian
election. About the normal Ukrainians, they would prefer to go with the NATO, because that's what the modern world is all about. But perhaps the
NATO and EU in 2024.
European Union, NATO, and obviously there is a very thin red line. I don't think it's thin anymore. It's very clear now that the Russians would not like that.
They will not permit.
Coming to you, Amjad Shoaib Saab, a couple of points, sir. Number one, if you remember, sir, a few years ago, the Turkish Air Force shot down one of the Russian jets, in which 2 of the pilots were killed. And later on, there was a lot of pressure on Turkey by the Russians. Though Turkey is not a member of EU, but Turkey is a member of NATO. And there wasn't much support given to Turkey by the Western countries, especially UK and United States of America. And in that, I remember the Russians stopped their tourists to go to Turkey, and that business for 1 year was around 10 billion. Then, you know, they were renegotiating about the energy cost and the energy deals. Otherwise, if you look at it, another very important point, that certainly this law and order deteriorated in Turkey. There were a lot of bomb blasts, and Tourism was almost at a halt. People were very fearful, they were scared. Now, sir, looking at this situation, what if a single bullet is fired from the eastern side towards Russia, sir, and in retaliation something happens? What do you see?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. See, the situation for Russia is very serious. NATO has moved into right across Russia, and they are threatening them. If you recall, Russia had presented few conditions. They had requested that the missile defense will be shifted from there. NATO should not include Ukraine in their fold. So all such things are primarily to avoid having NATO right at their doorstep. Now, with this situation coming up, Americans have found an excuse and they are building up, they are providing weapons. UK, they're lifting weapons and they are strengthening defense in Ukraine. Russia should have gone round and they should have tried to effect a blockade around Ukraine, which they have failed to do. And now Ukraine, with the passage of time, they will be building up the defense and they'll become very strong, and it will become difficult for Russia to do much about it. Russia, very genuinely, I think, they are in a tight corner and they are trying to find out a way where they can keep NATO at least away from them. Unfortunately, they are not plenty. Russia has threatened that they will also take their missiles to South America. They have threatened that, like 1962, they will go to Cuba and other places. But if you recall, at that time, President Kennedy, they intercepted Russian ships and they didn't allow them to, and Russian ships had to go back. So this was the action which Russia could have done, and they haven't done it. I think they are in a difficult situation. I agree that Europe, etc., they have a problem that Russia cut off their gas. But at the same time, Russia will also be losing a lot of money because of sanctions. They are already in difficulty, and their economy is picking up. They are looking for cash here and there all over the world.
And you're right, the American president has also said that there will be unprecedented sanctions on the Russians in case of an aggression.
And I think Russia will have to go to the negotiation table, and perhaps they'll be forced to look for some kind of negotiation solution. And if in return they can get something to improve their security environment, that will be very good. That seems to be a little far-fetched.
And Jalsab, at the same time, since we always talk about, I mean, there could be multiple sort of sanctions, starting from the dollar, from the transactions into the banks, to the deployment of the forces, to another level that when you talk about this energy, I mean, we all know Russia is full of energy resources. But sir, one important point is that there was a story that Poland recently signed a contract with Saudi Arabia for LNG. Now, Qatar is also enjoying pretty decent relationship with GCC countries. Don't you think the countries in the Middle East, under the influence of the Americans in particular, sir, I mean, these countries would look after the Europeans' energy needs rather than depending too much on Russia? Do you think that could be a problem, sir?
See, Russia is linked with the European countries through a direct pipeline. Germany perhaps is the one which will be very much affected. And that supply line is, if that is cut off, then naturally they will have to import liquid gas from Qatar and Middle East, from other countries. That becomes a little expensive, but at the same time, the international market will definitely be, perhaps there'll be a lot of price rise. So that way, I think it will affect the economies. And again, I think it's not the assured supply system if you try to import the liquid gas from various countries. So gas supply line is very crucial for their country, and they are very much concerned about it. And they have, particularly Germany, have indicated their concern to America, and they need to kind of reaction which Americans are showing. But at the same time, I think the Americans have gone too far. They are already building up in Ukraine, and they seem to be determined to contain Russia. And I have a feeling that it will be difficult for the Russians to attack Ukraine because of the sanctions. Immediately, on one hand, they will have an excuse to keep on pumping weapons to Ukraine. On the other hand, they will impose sanctions, and those sanctions will start having crippling effect on the Russian economy. So that, I think Russia is in a very difficult situation, and I don't think they will be
All right, sir.
going for any aggressive move. They perhaps will look for a negotiated solution.
I mean, that is perhaps the way forward. But coming to you now, Sami Hamdi Saab. First of all, sir, thank you very much for being in our show. This is the first time that you're appearing. Now, sir, when you look at the statements issued from Mr. Blinken or his counterpart from Russia, Mr. Lavrov, there wasn't any conclusion on the discussion. They said, well, they should move forward with the talks and all. But now it seems that there could be some sort of an attempt from either side. Because if you look at Russia, they will not step back. Vladimir Putin is a very different leader, I would say, and things have changed on ground also. Talking about the Western world, they have their own agenda. When you look at the Americans, they very categorically have mentioned that we have two adversaries. One is Russia, one is China. Your take?
I think first and foremost, it's important to stress that for the Russians, this is a matter of, this is a security matter and a very important one. When you look at a map of NATO bases in Europe and NATO presence around the Mediterranean, you can see that from the Russian perspective, they believe there's an encroachment. Every year, NATO seems to be getting closer and closer to the Russian border. Every time NATO seems to be opening a new base, whether that's in Poland and the like. And therefore, the idea that Ukraine, which is right on the border with Russia, which Russia considers historically part of Russia as well, is one step too far with regards to Vladimir Putin. I think the reality is, in this issue, Putin believes that he has the support of the Russian people and indeed of the Russian state. He believes that domestically, he's firmly united, people are firmly united on this issue that the Ukraine should not be allowed to be a stomping ground for NATO. This is in contrast to the Western allies, the NATO allies, in which there are clear differences, as has been alluded earlier, between Germany and between the United States. And that's why we heard a few days ago that the Chancellor of Germany refused to speak to Biden on a phone call. And that's also why we heard Biden assert that after the Zoom call, that there was unanimous unity. In other words, he didn't give details as to what this unity looks like. All he said was there is unity in a bid to dispel rumors and assertions that there are these deep divisions within NATO with regards to how to handle Russia. Because for all of the suggestions that Biden offers with regards to gas, whether that's asking Qatar to ship the gas as the like, as has been said before, that's far more expensive than receiving Russian gas, which supplies 40% of Europe's needs through the pipelines that already exist. So Germany is not interested in seeing any military escalation with regards to Ukraine. It's one of the reasons why there wasn't a fierce response when Russia took Crimea. And it's also why there's a very much assertion on negotiations. The problem for the US or the problem for Washington is that this crisis comes on the back of the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, what's considered a foreign policy failure for the United States. It comes amidst this perception that Biden's foreign policy is not panning out in the way that he had hoped. Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia is no longer considered a pariah by Biden, and now there is increased dialogue between Saudi Arabia and between Washington. The issues in the region, such as Libya and the like, the Libya elections didn't happen, and all these other issues that Biden promised to resolve or have an impact on are not being resolved. So for Biden, he cannot be seen to be giving in to the Russians, even though he doesn't want a war. He cannot be seen to be giving Putin what he wants after having criticized Trump for so many years as having conceded to Putin and being an agent of Russia and the like. And this is why, on the one hand, we see Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary of the US, saying we put 8,000 troops on standby that are ready to go to Ukraine. But he doesn't send those troops to Europe. He leaves them in the US, essentially making a statement that sounds strong, that sounds powerful.
Because that was the demand of the Ukrainian president, that nothing tangible has been said from the American side. So perhaps this statement was very much due, and the Ukrainian leadership perhaps really wanted to listen to this.
I think it's important. You mentioned the Ukrainian angle, and that's, I think, is the most difficult part in all of this. In that, for the Ukrainians, the world is watching to see how the US will react to an ally that is calling for assistance, that is calling for help against Russian aggression, against this Russian encroachment, against these 100,000 Russian troops, against these videos of these tanks that are being sent to the front, these battleships that are being sent to the front after Crimea has been lost. Ukraine is saying quite loudly, we expect the US as our ally to do something. And after what happened in Afghanistan, in which the US spectacularly abandoned Ashraf Ghani and abandoned the government that it helped to prop up, the reality is that all of the US allies are looking at Biden and thinking, okay, what's Biden going to do here with regards to Russia? Is he going to concede, or is he going to help the Ukrainians who are asking the US for help? And this is why it's far more complicated for Biden than it is for Putin. For Putin, everybody is united in that NATO is encroaching. It's getting closer and closer to the Russian border. It cannot be allowed to set up a base in Ukraine. And the reality is that when you ask any objective analyst, this is a legitimate concern, albeit Putin is not necessarily the most democratic or the most free of leaders who inspires freedom and the like. But nevertheless, there is a legitimate fear here. The issue for Biden is that he wants to negotiate a solution in which he can present as one in which he looks strong. And currently, there isn't a solution on the table, or there isn't a resolution that makes him look strong. It all makes Putin look strong, in that even if there is the threat of sanctions, Germany doesn't want to impose those sanctions. Germany doesn't want to be hamstrung with regards to its gas supplies. Meanwhile, Putin looks as if he's pushed back NATO, that is increasingly encroaching, and Biden instead looks like the one who was unable to unite his Western allies and
Very well
unable
said,
to
very well said.
make Putin
And
concede.
one
So it's a
more
very
important-
difficult situation.
Yeah, one more important point. I mean, obviously there is always a propaganda before the war, even during the war. And that is how to malign the other. Like we have heard about this concept of axis of evil, for that matter. Or somebody has to be shown as a bad guy. You know, in certain cases, when you look at the Western media, in particular, I've named these channels, whether it's CNN or BBC or Deutsche Welle, Germany is comparatively balanced in their approach, but so many other Western channels. Now, what has happened is that I was listening to Mr. Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson of Kremlin, and he very categorically mentioned that rather he accused the West of hysteria and putting out information. That's what he said. And he also mentioned that this is all happening because of what NATO and the US are doing, not because of what our stance is.
I think it's a valid point, but I do think that we should not get carried away too much with regards to the propaganda war, primarily because, as you said, it's part of the propaganda in terms of maligning the other, but there are also legitimate concerns on the part of the Ukrainians, who are the most affected by what is taking place. If there is war, they are the ones who will die. They are the ones who will suffer. They are the ones who will suffer economically. They are the ones whose houses will be bombed and the like. We've already seen Belarus send troops to the border with Ukraine, suggesting that it is ready to help Russia in case Russia needs that assistance. And the reason I mention the Ukrainians is that, let's be brutally honest here, in that Russia has legitimate security grievances. Russia has security concerns. But at the same time, if you're a Ukrainian and you're comparing between Western allies and between Russia, between states in which there is an easy transition of leadership through elections versus a country in which there is a domination of one man, of one power over the rest of the population. This is also one of the issues that are at hand here, in that when it comes to soft power, NATO soft power or Western soft power is far stronger than Russia. And I think this is one of the issues in...
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, coming to you, Dr. Saab, one important factor, if you remember, I mean, obviously you do, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. When you are in the backyard of the Americans, then the problem is there, and you know, whatever happened after that, the world was at a verge of a third world war, sir. I mean, literally a button away. Now, sir, they are not in the backyard. NATO is in the backyard, but Ukrainian issue, I mean, as Putin says, that you are in my porch now. So, and he's right in a way, sir. Yes, Western media, Western propaganda is there trying to malign him and show him as a bad guy. But at the end of the day, sir, don't you think that even the Russians have some very legitimate concerns? I mean, Ukraine, border, no more East movement. This was decided. And if you remember, sir, in 2014, when Crimea got annexed and there was this issue, they had a clash, 14,000 people died. the Russians supported the rebels, pro-Russian rebels. 14,000 is a big number, sir. And whatever happened after that, I mean, 14,000 again. Now, sir, this could happen again.
No, Faisal, we have to first, this analogy.
Why would Putin like the current government to stay in place, sir?
We have to make it clear. Generally, we see that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Russians were the bad guy. No, it was the NATO or the Americans first they violated. They deployed in the Turkey missiles and then the Cuba. So in a reaction, they have to pay the price. And after that, we have seen the different things. Anyway, coming back to this, we have to take into account that in the Europe, if Germany and France, if they are not willing to support the NATO or the Americans, then they will be not. Second,
then there will be no war.
There will be no war. There will be a rhetoric or why.
Standoff could remain there.
Yeah,
but
because
no
they were aware. If you recall, when the tactical weapons were deployed by the Americans and the, you can say, Russians, and at that time Germans concluded that who will be killed? Germans. So either in the eastern or in the western. So similarly, when they go for this kind of a thing, who will be killed? Europeans. So this is number one. Number two, it's not a new thing. If you see, when the NATO expanded and then the missile defense system components like their forward deployed interceptors, radars, they have deployed in Romania, Poland and in Czech Republic, and immediately Russians deployed their short-range missiles in the Iskander missile in the border area, and after that things started. But I have came across another report in which the Americans are promising to the Russians that they are not going to make a part of the Ukraine NATO as well as Georgia as a part of the NATO, and that will be a, you can say, some kind of an arrangement, and the troops will go back. But if the war will start, and as you refer, 16,000 people were killed, at that time Russians were covertly supporting the separatists. But this time they have a 100,000 troops deployed, and Europeans are aware what is the Russian military muscle. So the Europeans will be not going to take a risk if they, and neither they have a capacity nor their strategic culture, because in the last 75 years their strategic culture has been transformed into pacifist strategic culture. These are the realities. Now if you ask the Americans, when Georgia's 2 provinces were annexed in 2008, at that time Russia was not powerful like this today. They did not respond. That in 2014, Crimea, and then in 2015, the way the Russians came to Syria to protect their interests there.
Did it?
And then in the case of Turkey, yes, when they had a collision with the Russians, and later on they purchased S-400 missiles, the American imposed sanctions on them last January. But this year, when 5 billion plus missiles equipments were purchased, as 400 missile batteries were purchased by the Indians, Americans threatened to India that we had because they passed the law in 2017, but then Americans realized that their market may go to the Russians. So in this law there is no waiver, but then in 2018 they make an amendment, and in the December the missile components started moving towards India, and Americans are silent. So in this geostrategic environment and in the emerging, though the world is becoming more and more complex, but my understanding is that Americans will not commit a mistake where NATO and Russia go for head-on collision. Yes, there will be a rhetoric, there will be a propaganda. Americans try to use their soft power, or the NATO countries' soft power, and now we have to understand in this digital world, this soft power is also very much compromised.
Absolutely.
So in this context, if something will go wrong, which I am not expecting, this time the biggest sufferers will be the Ukrainians. Of course, if Russians go for a typical war like a small incursion or limited war, then the Russians will suffer, but Russians have a different strategy this time. And if you say that why they can permit the NATO, as you use the word, in my porch, they are on their border, and historically Ukraine has a different history. We have to not forget. So why the this history one is forgetting? The Russians had always claimed there, and then in the eastern Ukraine there's a pro-Russian.
Definitely. Now, Jalsa, obviously recently this national security policy was announced in Pakistan. a very comprehensive package. I've also heard you talking about that. Now, sir, when you talk about the Russians' geostrategic policy or their national security policy, sir, Ukraine issue and this movement of the NATO from the west towards east, I mean, there has to be a check, there has to be a balance, and there has to be a certain line. Do you think the Europeans, the NATO and the Americans in particular are trying to challenge the Russian authority by crossing the line, sir?
Crossing the line. As we have already discussed, Ukraine is right on the borders of Russia, and at the same time, if you have NATO there, it will be posing a very serious threat to the Russian security. So they cannot ignore. So naturally, their concern is absolutely genuine. You cannot deny that. But at the same time, they are in a difficult situation. If they react, then definitely American sanctions are going to be imposed on them. So, I mean, these are the two evils in which they have to find out the solution. That is why I've been saying that ultimately they have to get back to the negotiation table, and they will try to extract some kind of guarantees from the Americans that they will not include Ukraine for the time being into in the fold of NATO, and at the same time they will keep on insisting that you shift your desired from our borders. So that kind of thing will continue. And in the meantime, I think the Russians will try to explore the Southern American countries that they can also put their foot and try to pose a threat to the Americans. That kind of thing will definitely be explored. But in this process, Russians will try to buy the time so that they can find another solution. And that will happen through negotiation. Otherwise, this situation is very explosive. It is absolutely right that its sufferers will be the Ukrainians because that will be the battleground. But the proxy war will be fought by America, NATO, and Russia. So that way, there is a coalition which is very strong. At the same time, the Americans are determined. And as has been said earlier, that Biden is in a very difficult situation. He has already suffered a humiliating defeat in Afghanistan and a very haphazard sort of withdrawal from there. And he has lost his name. So naturally, he will be trying to find a solution whereby he can project himself to be a strong person and a man who has really added to the American prestige. So that way, I don't see that Biden has any chance of giving in. I think he will stick to his stance, and it will be the Russians who will have to look for a negotiation, have to go to the negotiation table, and that way, perhaps some stage will take place where Russians will buy the time and ultimately try to find out another solution where they can pose a threat to the American security by some South American countries.
And at the same time, the NATO and the US, they have also rejected the Russian security demands. And now coming to you, Mr. Sami, Hamdi, last couple of minutes, that's all I have at the moment. Now, one important point, since we are talking about this transatlantic alliance, warning of sanctions to deter Russia, one option regarding energy, another, the dollar transactions, I was reading about that could really jeopardize the Russian economy. At the same time, now, when you talk about the other adversary, that is China, I mean, Chinese have been engaged, whether it's regarding the Taiwanese issue or in the South China Sea, and there are certain areas where the Chinese are challenged almost on daily basis. The presence of the US and the British, I would say, huge naval assets out there. One country is being challenged, another. Do you believe, is it a part of the new world order that the Americans are setting? This is what the future is all about, that at the end of the day, whether we like it or we don't, Americans have that kind of an influence. They have the hegemony, they have the control, and they can challenge the Russians and the Chinese at the same time.
I think it's more scrambling to contain the decline of US hegemony over the world. I think we're seeing more unilateral action being taken by US allies, whether that's the UAE, whether that's Turkey, whether that's Saudi Arabia, which is cooperating with the Chinese to build missile defense systems after US withdrew Patriot missiles, whether that's Pakistan itself, which is balancing between the superpowers, between the US and China after being isolated by the US. Now it has good relations with China to balance against it, and it's asserting itself with regards to Afghanistan and other regional issues, whether that's with Iran, which is sitting down on the negotiating table and dictating its terms to the US and actually forcing the global powers to recognize its gains in the Middle East, in Iraq, Syria, etc. So I think what we're seeing is not the US saying, I am still the hegemon, but more the US saying, look, our influence is clearly in decline. Our allies are no longer trusting us. Afghanistan has damaged our image. This is about now trying to ensure that nobody capitalizes on that, whether that's Russia, whether that's China. It's about trying to impose some sort of discipline on a world order that is disintegrating, that is becoming increasingly multipolar, that is becoming increasingly tense, that is becoming increasingly no longer dominated necessarily by Western powers and moving east. You'll note an advisor to Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE, Abdullah, he tweeted and said that when the UAE was given the choice between F-15s and Chinese 5G, we chose Chinese 5G because the future is in Asia and not necessarily in the West. So there are these changing perceptions, and this is one of the reasons why everybody would be watching what Biden does in Ukraine with regards to Russia. He abandoned one ally in the Ashraf Ghani government that was propped up. Now they're looking to see what happens now with the Ukraine. Can he force Putin to, can he impose his will on Putin, or can he negotiate with Putin and still look strong? And the reality is that Putin has a golden opportunity in that if Biden backs down, we'll see a lot more delegations going to Moscow. We'll see more delegations going to Beijing. And what's interesting is we're even seeing rumors that Xi Jinping asked Putin not to invade Ukraine. China denied that. But the point here being that there is an attempt now to even drive a wedge between China and Russia to sort of encourage tensions between the two, to ensure that whatever happens, this partnership does not capitalize on what is clearly a waning US influence. So I think what we're seeing is this is part of the shift that is taking place in the world, in which the US is no longer the hegemon it wants.
All right, Hamdi, I'm so sorry. We are totally running out of time, but I would like to say thank you so much for your time. Jaspal, it was a pleasure having you in the show, sir. Thank you very much for your time also. And Jaspal Saab, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. So thank you so much. And that's all we have for this hour. I'll see you inshallah tomorrow at 8:05. Till then, you take good care. Khuda Hafiz.